Hello, everyone. Tonight we begin with a life so bleak you'd consider a matchstick a miracle. From nights spent shivering in a pile of damp relatives, to chewing meat so raw it was still judging you, to falling asleep in darkness so complete you weren't sure if your eyes were open. This was existence before humans learned to set things on fire. Take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. I like knowing who's out there in the dark with me. Now, lower the lights, maybe wrap yourself in something warm. Let the room go quiet. We're going to slip back into a world where the night owned you, the cold drained you, and dinner could kill you. Let me tell you about the person you could have been, the one who popped into existence before humans figured out that setting stuff on fire was the key to not dying. Your first breath wouldn't be met with the warm glow of a hearth. No, you'd arrive in a room temperature best described as corpse storage. Babies weren't welcomed with cuddles under a blanket fresh from the dryer. They were plopped into a world where heated meant still faintly warm from the animal that used to be inside this fur. Forget lullabies. The soundtrack to your infancy would be the sound of wind leaking into whatever passed for shelter. A rock overhang, a pile of sticks, maybe a cave if your group's VIPs hadn't already claimed it. There was no flickering orange light on the walls at night, only a blackness so thick it could be bottled and sold as despair. The moon, if it showed up at all, would provide a light level slightly better than squinting into a closed coffin. And the cold, it wasn't the cute, I can see my breath kind. It was the kind that started as a tickle in your skin, then dug its fingers into your bones and refused to leave. You'd spend your nights as part of an unwilling human lasagna, layered between relatives purely for body heat. There was nothing romantic about it. Huddling together wasn't a symbol of prehistoric community. It was the only reason you weren't an infant-shaped ice sculpture by morning. Rain was an even better killer. With no fire, there was no drying your soaked animal skins, no steaming your sodden bedding. You stayed wet until the sun decided to help, which it didn't always. And wet in this world wasn't just uncomfortable, it was a countdown to hypothermia. If you were unlucky enough to be born during a cold season in a temperate or subarctic climate, congratulations, you were basically running a daily survival experiment where failure meant becoming a snack for something with sharper teeth. Everyone's skin around you would be hardened and cracked from years of weather exposure. The elders would have faces carved by the wind, and the children, including you, would carry the permanent knowledge that warmth was never guaranteed. You weren't kept warm so much as kept barely alive. The only central heating system was the collective mammal pile, and if you got pushed to the outside, well, it was nice knowing you. And the worst part, you wouldn't even know fire existed yet. You'd think this was just how life worked, freezing every night, praying the sun showed up in the morning, and living in fear of rain. Because without fire, the cold wasn't a season, it was your landlord. Which is exactly why, when the sun finally came up, your people wouldn't start the day thinking about breakfast. They'd be thinking about whether today would be warm enough to hunt, work, or simply stop you from freezing into a tragic archaeological discovery. And that's when the next problem of your life without fire would creep in. Because warmth wasn't your only missing luxury, light was too. Without fire, night didn't fall, it crushed. The moment the sun dipped, your world turned into a black pit where you couldn't see your own hand. And frankly, you didn't want to, because there was a decent chance something with claws was standing right next to you. No flickering torches, no lamps glowing politely in the corner. Your only lighting system was the moon, which, like a terrible landlord, often just didn't show up. And when it did, it barely managed to illuminate the tips of rocks you'd trip over anyway. Starlight helped if you were feeling optimistic, but it wasn't much good for anything except helping you guess where the cliff started. Your species hadn't yet figured out how to bully the night back with flame. So once darkness arrived, productivity stopped dead. You couldn't keep weaving, carving, or fixing tools after sundown unless you were keen on stabbing yourself with a bone awl. Hunting at night, forget it. You couldn't see the prey, but the predators could definitely see you and smell you, and hear your heartbeat speed up when something moved in the brush. Nighttime meant vulnerability on every front. The big cats of the Pleistocene, lions, leopards, saber-toothed cats, all had better night vision than you. Hyenas, wolves, even large owls had the advantage. You were basically a slow, naked buffet item, walking around in a world designed for carnivores on night shift. The only real defense was to lie low and hope the dark moved on without noticing. Social life also died after sunset. There were no late-night strategy meetings or long communal stories under firelight because, well, there was no firelight. If you wanted to talk to someone, you had to do it in whispers in the pitch black, which was less bonding and more accidentally spitting on each other in the dark. Humans today talk about fire as if it's romantic. Back then, it was just the line between having a communal life after dusk and lying in silence while imagining exactly which teeth were approaching. And let's not forget navigation. You couldn't just step outside to relieve yourself without calculating the risk of wandering too far and never finding the shelter again. Without light, even familiar landscapes turned alien. The same trail you walked every day could twist into a death maze once shadows swallowed it. So you learned the rhythm. Sun up, life starts. Sun down, life stops. If you didn't get it done during daylight, it simply didn't happen. Nights weren't for living, they were for surviving until the next sunrise, hoping that whatever moved out there stayed far enough away to give you another day. And just when you thought you could handle the dark, you'd remember the other joy of a world without fire, the raw, unappetizing reality of every single thing you put in your mouth. Because in your fireless life, food wasn't a pleasure. It was a full-contact sport. Everything you ate was raw, and not the kind of raw that gets plated in a fancy restaurant with wasabi on the side. We're talking raw meat from an animal that was alive about 15 minutes ago, still twitching if you were especially unlucky. You'd chew until your jaw ached, and then chew some more. Because prehistoric meat wasn't tender, it was practically leather with a heartbeat. Muscle fibers stayed locked in their stubborn little bundles because nothing had broken them down with heat. That meant each bite took forever, and you spent more time gnawing than actually swallowing. Your teeth weren't tools for smiling. They were industrial grinders, and meat was only half the misery. Plant foods, wild tubers, nuts, seeds, were no picnic either. Tubers straight from the ground were fibrous, gritty, and often bitter. Some carried toxins that cooking would have destroyed, but since you didn't have that option, you just hoped your stomach could handle it. Many plants came with anti-nutrients, compounds like tannins or lectins that blocked mineral absorption, so you could eat a bellyful and still be malnourished. Digesting raw starches and proteins burned more energy than eating them provided. That's the evolutionary punchline. Sometimes you came out of a meal with fewer usable calories than you started with. Your gut was working overtime, but you still felt weak. It's no wonder our species' brains didn't explode in size until cooking entered the picture. Fire made calories cheaper for the body to unlock. And then there were the hazards hiding in every bite. Raw meat carried parasites like trichinella and tapeworms, plus bacteria such as salmonella and E. coli. There was no cook until juices run clear safety standard. If it smelled okay, you ate it. If it didn't smell okay, you probably still ate it, because the alternative was starving. Food poisoning wasn't a freak occurrence, it was practically a career path. Spoilage was another constant threat. Without heat to preserve food, meat began rotting almost immediately, especially in warmer climates. Scavenged kills were fair game, but that meant you were eating something other predator teeth had already tested. And don't expect delicate flavors. Every bite was either aggressively bland or aggressively foul, with no middle ground. Your jaw muscles would bulk up from all the chewing, but the rest of you might still waste away if food was scarce or your body rejected too much of it. Eating wasn't a time to relax and enjoy. It was a survival task, complete with the risk of parasites hitching a ride in your intestines for years. So when you'd finally choke down your portion, wipe your mouth with the back of your hand and try to convince yourself you'd gotten used to it. You'd remember there was a whole other danger lurking inside that meal you couldn't see yet. Because if chewing raw meat until your jaw felt like it had arthritis wasn't enough, your food also came with an invisible lottery ticket, the kind where the prize was diarrhea, fever, and occasionally death. Every bite of raw animal flesh was a grab bag of microbial delights, salmonella, E. coli, campylobacter, all just waiting to turn your intestines into a slip and slide, and parasites. Oh, they loved you. Trichinella could curl up in your muscles like little biological paperclips. Tapeworms could take up permanent residence in your gut, and roundworms would happily compete with you for every calorie you managed to choke down. Cooking would have killed them, of course, but you didn't have cooking. You had wishful thinking and an immune system doing its best under conditions it never signed up for. If you got sick, there was no rest, rehydrate, and take antibiotics. There were no antibiotics. There wasn't even clean water to rehydrate with, which meant you'd sometimes drink from the same stream you'd just used as a butchering station. It's not that your ancestors didn't notice the connection between certain meals and certain deaths. They just didn't have a better option. And it wasn't just meat. Raw tubers, seeds and leafy plants could carry their own bacterial and fungal freeloaders. Mold spores, aflatoxins, and soil-borne pathogens hitchhiked into your body with every bite. If you dug something out of the ground, you ate it dirt and all, because there was no tap to rinse it under. Spoiled food was an even worse gamble. Without fire to cook or smoke dry meat, anything you didn't finish quickly turned into a bacterial playground. Your nose might give you a warning, but in seasons when food was scarce, you'd eat it anyway, because food poisoning now was still better than slow starvation later. That's the level of culinary decision-making you were stuck with. The symptoms weren't just unpleasant, they were in a world without medicine. Severe diarrhea and vomiting could dehydrate you to death in a matter of days, especially if you were already malnourished. Children and the elderly were the first to go. Adults sometimes developed partial immunity to local pathogens. But that didn't help if your group moved to a new area with new bacteria that treated you like an all-you-can-eat buffet. So, every meal was a calculated risk, and food safety wasn't a concept, it was a fantasy. And just when your stomach managed to survive the bacteria and parasites, the food still made sure to insult you in one last way, by giving you fewer calories than you actually needed to stay alive. Because even if you somehow dodged the bacteria, the parasites, and the food poisoning, there was still one more insult waiting for you inside every raw meal. Your body wasn't very good at getting energy out of it. See, without fire, every bite you ate was essentially locked up in its natural defense systems. Plant foods, roots, seeds, grains were full of anti-nutrients like tannins, lectins, and phytates. These charming little chemicals did a great job of keeping the plant alive by making it harder for your stomach to get at the minerals inside. Iron blocked. Calcium, not today. Zinc, forget it. The plant was protecting itself from being digested, and you had no way to fight back except to eat more, which of course burned more energy trying to chew, swallow, and process it all. Raw meat wasn't much better. Yes, it had protein, but those tightly bound muscle fibers were a pain for your enzymes to break apart. Cooking unwinds those proteins into something more cooperative. Raw meat just sat in your gut, making your digestive system work double shifts for less pay and fat. Sure, it was there, but without heat to melt it down and help your body absorb it more efficiently. A lot of that precious energy slid through you before you could use it. Even the calories you did get came at a price. Chewing raw food takes far longer and burns more energy than chewing cooked food. Your jaw muscles were like overworked factory machinery, constantly grinding through fibers and sinew. Archaeologists can even tell how much chewing your ancestors had to do by looking at their skulls. Robust jaws, big teeth, and heavy wear patterns that scream lifetime of eating things that didn't want to be eaten. And because digestion was so inefficient, you needed to eat a lot more just to meet your body's daily demands. That meant more hours spent foraging, more hours spent hunting, and more hours spent gnawing your way through meals that often gave you less net energy than you'd used to get them. It's like running on a treadmill while eating a salad. You end up wondering why you're still tired and still hungry at the same time. It also meant you were in constant competition with the rest of your group for whatever high-calorie food did exist, usually fatty meat or marrow. The marrow, by the way, you'd get to by smashing open bones with rocks. No fire-roasted soft savory reward, just greasy raw fat you'd scoop out with your fingers, hoping it was fresh enough not to give you dysentery. Seasonal changes made it worse. In colder months, your body needed more calories to keep warm, but the raw foods available were often lower in energy and harder to digest. Without fire to transform tough tubers into soft, digestible starch, or to make meat yield more calories, you were running a survival equation where the math never quite worked out in your favor. And here's the real evolutionary punchline. Without cooked food, your species' brains had to run on a tighter energy budget. The human brain is an expensive organ. It burns about 20% of your daily calories, and raw diets simply didn't give the same surplus. That's one reason why, For hundreds of thousands of years, your ancestors' brains stayed smaller. Fire didn't just make food tastier. It fueled the mental hardware that eventually allowed you to complain about the Wi-Fi. But back in your cold, fireless life, you weren't building civilizations or philosophy. You were burning daylight, wearing down your teeth, and burning calories just to scrape enough energy together to keep breathing. And as if that wasn't exhausting enough, the night brought another delightful threat, one that didn't care about your digestion at all, because it preferred to eat you. Because in the absence of fire, you weren't the top of the food chain. You were somewhere between interesting snack and easy calories. Let's be clear, without flame, you had no intimidation factor after sunset. Firelight keeps most predators at a respectful distance. Without it, your scent, your noise, and your general lack of claws turned you into a walking dinner invitation. Lions, leopards, saber-toothed cats, all of them had better night vision, better hearing, better speed, and significantly better teeth than you. You couldn't even see them until they were close enough to hear their breathing, at which point, frankly, you were already in the process of losing. And predators didn't just hunt for food, they also scouted for opportunity. If they learned that the dark lump of humans under the rock ledge didn't have a fire to keep them back, they'd return, over and over. That's the problem with being predictable prey. You turn into a regular stop on the carnivore buffet circuit. Your defensive strategy at night was painfully primitive. Stay still, stay quiet, and hope the animal that smelled you decided it wasn't hungry enough. There were no barricaded doors, no sharpened stakes, no watchtowers. You might have had crude spears or heavy rocks, but in darkness they were more for morale than actual safety. If something big decided to lunge, you'd only have time to scream, and that would just make it easier for the rest of the group to find what was left of you in the morning. Even if you were lucky enough to live in a group large enough to mount a defense, there was no organized night watch. Humans weren't great at staying awake all night in the cold, and fatigue was lethal when predators could sprint faster than you could stand up. Your best bet was to sleep somewhere awkward in a tree, on a cliff ledge, inside a cramped rock crevice, trading comfort for a slightly lower chance of waking up with teeth in your neck. Hyenas were a particular problem. Modern spotted hyenas can crush bones with 1,000 pounds of force per square inch. Their prehistoric relatives were even larger. Without fire, your only hyena repellent was keeping your distance and hoping they found something else first. Leopards were quieter, more patient, and perfectly happy to climb into whatever tree you thought was keeping you safe. And the saber-toothed cats, they didn't need speed to terrify you. The sight of those elongated canines in daylight was enough to give you insomnia at night. Predators also weren't your only problem. Scavengers, like jackals or vultures, would follow hunting parties back to camp, looking for scraps, which in turn attracted the bigger predators. Without fire to keep them all back, a kill made during the day could easily turn into a nighttime feeding frenzy. And if you were still sitting too close to it, you might become part of the menu. So, you learned to live with a certain constant hum of fear, sleeping in silence, flinching at every crack of a branch, holding your breath at the sound of movement in the dark. This was your bedtime routine. You weren't resting. You were gambling with unconsciousness. And while predators had the power to kill you quickly, another threat was slower, itchier, and far more persistent, one that fire could have solved in seconds, but you had to endure for hours. Because in a world without fire, the things that wanted to eat you weren't always big, loud, or dramatic. Sometimes, they were tiny, relentless, and absolutely convinced your blood was a free buffet. See, smoke isn't just a byproduct of fire, it's the oldest insect repellent humans ever had. Without it, you were a full-time target for mosquitoes, sandflies, and ticks, all of them more than happy to keep you awake and itchy for the entire night. You couldn't shoo them away with a candle or wave them off with a burning stick. You just lay there, slapping at your skin, listening to that high-pitched mosquito whine getting closer and closer until you finally gave up and let them eat. And these weren't just harmless annoyances. Every bite was a possible delivery system for something worse. Malaria, yellow fever, dengue. You didn't know the names, but you knew the symptoms. Fever, shivering, sweating, and the creeping realization that you might not see next season. For ticks, the risks included Lyme disease and other bacterial infections, assuming you even found the tick before it finished draining you and dropped off to find your cousin. Then there were the parasites you picked up from sleeping on bare ground. Without fire, there was no warm smoke to clear away mites, fleas, or lice. Your bedding, if you had any, was just another habitat for them, and they'd happily live on you, in you, or both. Fleas carried their own set of diseases. Lice could cause chronic skin irritation and secondary infections. Mites, they didn't kill you, but they could make your skin crawl, literally, until you scratched it raw. Even your food and water weren't safe from the microscopic invaders. Without the ability to boil water, you drank whatever stream or pond you could find, along with the protozoa and worms living in it. Giardia, Cryptosporidium, and roundworms all thrived in untreated water. The result was a cycle of diarrhea and dehydration that could flatten even the strongest in your group. And because everyone shared the same limited water sources, once something made it in, the whole camp could be dealing with the same delightful gastrointestinal symphony. The itch, the discomfort, the constant risk of infection. It wore you down. You'd lose sleep, lose energy, and eventually lose the ability to hunt or forage effectively. And in a survival economy where every able body counted, becoming too sick or too weak from insect-borne illness was as dangerous as running into a predator. Some groups tried primitive defenses, covering themselves in mud to block biting insects, wrapping tightly in hides or plant fibers, or sleeping in spots with higher wind to make it harder for bugs to land. But none of these were perfect, and many came with their own problems. Mud cracks and falls away. Hides get damp and grow mold. And sleeping in exposed windy spots meant waking up colder than you already were. Fire would have solved most of this. A smoky fire keeps insects at bay, dries out bedding, and lets you boil water. Without it, you were basically running an open-door policy for every parasite in the neighborhood. And if all those tiny bloodsuckers didn't kill you, the real killer was still waiting. The endless, grinding cold that came when winter hit and you had nothing to push it back. Because if the bugs didn't get you, the cold would, and it didn't even have to try very hard. Without fire, there was no such thing as warming up. The cold wasn't an occasional guest, it was a full-time roommate that never paid rent and ate all your calories. Your only insulation came from whatever you could wrap around yourself. Untreated animal hides, if you were lucky. Woven grasses or plant fibers if you weren't. And hides without proper tanning stayed stiff, heavy, and damp. They also smelled like exactly what they were. The outer layer of something that used to run faster than you. In temperate climates, the chill would creep in during evenings and mornings. In cold or subarctic zones, it never left. The wind cut through clothing like it wasn't there. Snow and ice weren't just pretty background elements. They were constant, exhausting enemies. You couldn't build a fire to melt water for drinking, so you ate snow or ice, a process that cooled your core temperature even further, which is exactly what you didn't need when you were already shivering like a leaf in a storm. Your body would try to keep your vital organs warm by redirecting blood flow away from your hands, feet, ears, and nose. Those parts would go numb, then painful, then maybe just stay numb forever. Frostbite was a real possibility in colder regions, and without treatment, it meant infection or the slow rotting away of tissue. If you lost fingers or toes, that was it. Your ability to hunt, make tools, or even walk properly was permanently compromised. Rain made it worse. Animal hides, grasses, and bark absorbed water and held onto it, and without heat to dry them, you'd be wearing soggy insulation for days. Wet clothing accelerates heat loss, which meant hypothermia could sneak up on you fast. And hypothermia didn't care how tough you thought you were. It muddled your thinking, slowed your movements, and could finish you off before you realized how bad it was. Shelters helped, but without fire, they were just windbreaks. A rock overhang, a lean-to, or a pile of brush might block the breeze, but it wouldn't actually warm you. In fact, in still, damp air, the cold could settle heavier inside an enclosed space, leaving you lying there like a slowly cooling casserole. You'd burn through calories just trying to keep your body temperature stable, which meant you needed to eat more. A cruel joke, since winter was exactly when food was hardest to find. Many early human groups probably migrated seasonally to avoid the worst of the cold. But that was only possible if there was somewhere warmer within reach, and if predators, rival groups, or sheer bad luck didn't get in the way. And this wasn't a one-time struggle. Cold stress shaped your entire life, where you could travel, how you could hunt, even when you could sleep. All of it depended on managing your body heat, with nothing but biology and whatever materials the landscape gave you. No fire meant no warm mornings, no toasty shelters, no thawing frozen fingers. You just endured. And even if you somehow survived the freezing nights, you still had another massive limitation: the fact that without light or heat after sunset, your life shrank into the tiny window of daylight you had each day, because once the sun dropped, so did your to-do list. Without fire, nighttime wasn't a mysterious, romantic stretch of hours. It was a dead zone. The moment daylight slipped away, your productivity went off a cliff, and not a graceful swan dive, more like tripping over a rock and landing face first in a bush. You couldn't extend the day with torchlight, candles, or oil lamps. All of those required controlled flame, and you didn't have it. Your evening lighting system consisted of the moon, which was unpredictable at best, and the stars, which were too busy being pretty to actually help you see the giant rock in front of you. Clouds. They turned the dark into a sensory deprivation tank you didn't sign up for. That meant every task had to be crammed into daylight hours. Foraging, hunting, repairing tools, processing food, mending clothing, building or maintaining shelters. All of it was on the clock. And if the day ran out before you were done, too bad. That broken spear tip, fix it tomorrow. That animal hide you were scraping, hope it doesn't rot overnight. The daylight wasn't just important, it was a survival currency you could never stockpile. Social life suffered too. Humans are wired for connection, and in later ages, fire became the center of storytelling, teaching, and planning after dark. Without it, your people didn't gather in circles to share myths or strategies. You just went quiet. Sure, you could talk in the dark, but whispering into the pitch black while trying not to trip on someone's leg isn't exactly the foundation of thriving oral tradition. Every conversation had the constant undertone of, "Was that you?" or "something about to eat us." Crafting at night was out of the question. You couldn't see well enough to shape stone tools without slicing your own hand, working with bone or wood. Even worse, your hands needed light to follow the fine motor patterns, and one slip meant a wound that could easily turn into a fatal infection. Without light, creativity was limited to whatever you could do by touch, which, to be honest, wasn't much when the alternative was lying still to conserve heat. Security also dropped off at night. You couldn't see intruders, whether they were predators, rival humans, or scavengers looking to raid your food. Fire later solved this by creating a visible perimeter, but without it, you might as well have been blindfolded. A sudden noise in the dark sent everyone into tense silence, gripping stones or spears they couldn't aim properly even if they tried, and travel, completely off the table. No one in their right mind wandered far from camp without light. Even familiar routes became dangerous mazes when you couldn't see where your feet were landing. Rivers, cliffs, thorn bushes, all perfectly positioned to take advantage of your night blindness. And if you were injured in the dark, there was no rushing to help. Finding someone in the pitch black could take longer than keeping them alive. The night was essentially a prison sentence you served every day, locked inside the limits of your shelter or sleeping spot until morning. The only night shift you pulled was staying awake from anxiety, straining your ears for the sound of trouble, and hoping your body's heat didn't leak away before dawn. So, when the sun finally returned and you could start working again, the clock started ticking fast. And with so few hours to do so much, you ran headlong into another problem. Your technology was frozen in place because you couldn't use heat to transform materials into anything better. Because without fire, your technology was about as advanced as a toddler with a rock, which, in fairness, was still better than nothing, but not by much. Heat isn't just about comfort or cooking, it's the great material transformer. Without it, you are locked out of whole categories of tools and techniques. That beautifully sharpened spear point you're picturing. If it's stone, sure, you can chip one out, but if it's hardened wood, forget it. Heat-treating a spear tip turns it from pointy stick into pointy stick that might actually survive a hunt. Without fire, your weapon stayed soft, prone to snapping on first impact, leaving you holding the prehistoric equivalent of a broken chopstick, while the wounded animal decided it was your turn to run. Adhesives were another casualty. Some of the best natural glues, resins, tree pitch needed to be heated to make them sticky and workable. No fire meant no reliable hafting for stone points, no composite tools, and no secure bindings for handles. Everything you made had to be lashed together with sinew, fiber, or rawhide, which worked, until it got wet, shrank, loosened, and left your axe head rolling off into the undergrowth mid-swing. material processing a non-starter. Bone and antler could be shaped by abrasion, but fire-hardened tips and carved sockets were far more durable. Without controlled heat, shaping took longer, produced weaker tools, and left you more dependent on sheer brute force to get anything done. Forget pottery, forget metal, forget even the possibility of baking clay into anything stronger than mud. This technological ceiling also meant your range of survival strategies was narrower. No fire to shape better weapons meant hunting was riskier and often required close contact with dangerous animals. No heated glue meant less efficient arrows or spear points, so you needed bigger groups to bring down large prey, which meant more mouths to feed. The efficiency gap just kept widening. It even affected clothing. Later groups with fire could dry hides faster, smoke treat them for preservation, and make them more pliable. Without heat, hides stayed stiff and prone to rot. Your winter coat was basically a cold, damp, heavy rug you dragged around your shoulders until it gave you a rash. And because you couldn't waterproof or preserve it properly, you had to replace it more often, which meant more hunting, more skinning, more scraping, all in daylight hours you couldn't afford to waste. Even the stone tools you did have were limited by this lack of versatility. Some stones flaked better after controlled heating, making sharper, longer-lasting edges. You were stuck working with whatever the local geology gave you, meaning some days you had decent cutting edges, and some days you were sawing at a hide with a glorified rock potato. And let's not forget morale. Innovation thrives when you can sit around after dark, tinkering with ideas. Without light or heat, your research and development department was permanently closed after sunset. Every improvement had to happen in the few daylight hours that weren't already swallowed by food gathering, shelter repair, or just trying to stay alive. So your toolkit stayed basic, your weapons stayed flimsy, and your options stayed limited, which fed directly into the next constant headache of your pre-fire existence. You couldn't store food for later. If you didn't eat it immediately, something else would, and that something might not even wait for you to finish your first bite. Because without fire, your pantry was whatever you could carry in your hands, stomach, or maybe balance on your head. And since refrigeration hadn't been invented yet, or the concept of fridges, everything you got your hands on was on a very short timer before it turned into a biology experiment. Fire gave later humans the power to smoke dry meat, roast it to kill bacteria, or boil it into stews that lasted days. You got none of that. If you killed an animal, you had to eat as much as you could immediately and hope there were enough people around to finish it before the meat soured, stank, and drew a crowd of scavengers with sharper teeth. In warm climates, that safe window could be measured in hours, not days. And meat wasn't the only problem. Tubers, fruits and seeds could last a little longer, but raw plant foods were still vulnerable to rot, mold, and insect damage. Without the heat to dry them properly, you just stashed them in baskets, skin pouches, or pits in the ground, all of which were essentially invitations to rodents, insects, and opportunistic animals. A cleverly hidden stash might still be discovered by the nose of a hyena or the claws of a foraging bear. This meant hunting large game could be a curse as much as a blessing. Without a preservation method, a successful kill could become a massive waste. Picture this: you take the risk, spend the energy, land a big animal, and then spend the next 2 days in a frenzy trying to eat as much as possible, while the rest of it turns into a fly nursery. The smell alone would be a neon sign for every predator in the area, guaranteeing more nighttime visits to your camp. Water storage, same story. Without fire to boil water, you drank it as soon as you found it. Carrying it meant hauling it in animal skins or woven containers that could leak, tear, or grow algae faster than you could drink it. If your group was on the move, there was no hauling gallons of safe water for later. You stopped when you were thirsty, drank whatever you could find, and prayed it wasn't full of things that would make you sick. And because you couldn't store food, you were always living hand-to-mouth. That meant hunting or foraging every single day, regardless of the weather, your injuries, or the fact that predators also liked to hunt when you did. Any time you didn't gather or hunt meant going hungry, and going hungry meant your strength dropped, which made tomorrow's hunt even harder. It was a vicious cycle that left no room for real rest. It also meant seasonal shortages were brutal. In colder months, when plants died back and animals migrated, there was no stockpile to fall back on. You ate what you could find, and when you couldn't find enough, your body burned through its fat reserves, and once those were gone, it burned through you. That's why many early human groups migrated constantly, not just for warmth but to stay close to food sources before they were picked clean. And even if you somehow stayed fed, the constant daily grind of hunting and foraging under a tight daylight schedule kept your body in a perpetual calorie deficit, which was especially bad news in cold seasons when your metabolism was burning fuel just to keep you alive. A problem that brings us neatly to your next great pre-fire disadvantage: your body's endless battle to stay warm in an environment that wanted you dead. Because your body was in a constant, expensive war against the cold, and without fire, you were losing money in calories every single day. Humans are warm-blooded, which sounds like a brag until you realize it's just an engineering flaw with higher maintenance costs. Maintaining a core body temperature around 37 degrees Celsius isn't optional, and when the air around you drops even a few degrees, your body starts burning extra fuel to keep the lights on. In the cold seasons or year-round, if you lived in higher latitudes, your calorie budget could double just trying to stay alive. That meant every bit of food you gathered had to do two jobs: keep you from starving and keep you from freezing. And here's the problem: the raw, hard-to-digest diet you had before fire was spectacularly bad at giving you quick, usable energy. You might be gnawing on a raw root for 20 minutes, only to get 60 calories out of it, which your body would then spend in about 10 minutes of shivering. It was like trying to heat a house by burning damp cardboard. Shivering itself is your body's last-ditch emergency generator, involuntary muscle contractions that produce heat. Without a fire to actually warm you, you might shiver for hours at night, burning hundreds of calories without taking a single step. And because you couldn't just eat more to make up for it, there wasn't exactly a stocked pantry waiting. Every calorie burned on warmth was one less you had for moving, thinking, or healing. If you were lucky enough to have animal fat in your diet, it helped. Fat is a dense, slow-burning fuel, but catching and killing animals with enough fat to matter was harder without fire-hardened weapons. And even if you succeeded, that fat went rancid fast in warm climates. You couldn't render it for storage, so you ate it on the spot, got a short-term energy boost, and then went right back to running on empty. Seasonal changes made the math even crueler. Winter meant fewer edible plants, thinner animals, and less daylight to hunt or forage. Your body still demanded heat, but the food to produce it wasn't there. Fat reserves dwindled. Muscle began to break down to keep the rest of you alive. Your immune system weakened, making every little cut or sniffle a potential death sentence. And if you thought tropical or subtropical zones had it easier, think again. Wet seasons could drop nighttime temperatures enough to make people hypothermic, especially with soaked clothing and no way to dry it. You couldn't just bundle up either. Without tanned hides or woven fabrics designed for insulation, your clothing was mostly symbolic. It kept the sun off, maybe blocked some wind, but it wasn't keeping you truly warm. And since wet hides and plant fibers could weigh you down and trap cold against your skin, your warm clothes might actually be killing you faster. This constant thermoregulation tax didn't just sap your energy, it shaped your entire survival strategy. Where you lived, when you moved, how big your group could be, all of it was dictated by whether the environment was stealing more heat than you could replace. You were a prisoner of your own metabolism, chained to an endless cycle of eat to heat, heat to live, live to eat. And if you somehow survived the cold months, it wasn't because you were thriving, it was because you'd spent every waking hour feeding the furnace, which left very little time or energy for anything else, including growing your population to levels that could actually defend against the endless hazards around you. Because in your pre-fire world, humans weren't exactly packing the landscape like they do today. We weren't swarming the planet, we were barely clinging to it. And without the warmth, light, and food security that fire eventually brought, your species' numbers stayed painfully low. For starters, fireless living meant you couldn't spread into a lot of environments. Cold regions, forget it. Even temperate zones became risky in winter. Without a controlled heat source, settling anywhere with prolonged frost was basically signing up for seasonal mass funerals. Early humans without fire were stuck in narrower geographic ranges, which meant fewer available resources and smaller territories to support a group. Low numbers had a nasty domino effect. Smaller populations meant smaller hunting parties, which limited the size of prey you could take down safely. That, in turn, meant fewer calories per hunt, which meant less surplus food for children, elders, and pregnant women, the exact people who needed the most energy. Every calorie was accounted for, and in lean times there were fewer hands to gather, hunt, or defend what you had. Then there was reproduction. Without fire, infant mortality was brutal. Babies couldn't regulate body temperature well, so cold nights or wet conditions could kill them fast. Illness struck harder when you couldn't boil water, sterilize tools, or keep a newborn warm. If a child made it past infancy, disease, parasites, or just bad luck could still take them before adulthood. Anthropologists estimate that in early human groups, as many as half of all children didn't survive past the age of 5, and without fire, that number was likely even higher. Adults weren't safe either. Injury or illness in a small, scattered population had a bigger impact. If a hunter broke a leg, that could mean one less person providing food for weeks. If an infection set in from a cut, an animal bite, or foodborne illness, there was no way to treat it effectively. And in a tiny group, losing even one able-bodied adult could mean the difference between making it through the season or not. And because groups were small and scattered, they had fewer opportunities to exchange knowledge. Cultural transmission, sharing better hunting techniques, tool designs, or foraging strategies happened slowly. When your nearest neighbors were a day's walk away, and everyone was too busy not dying to host casual get-togethers. It's no coincidence that major leaps in technology and culture happened after fire allowed larger, more stable communities to exist. Predator pressure also kept populations in check. Larger human groups can defend against big cats, hyenas, and wolves more effectively, but small, spread-out bands without fire were easier targets. Predators could pick off members without having to face a wall of spears or the deterrent of flames. And if a few key members of your group died in quick succession, the survivors might not have the manpower to keep going. Seasonal migrations added another layer of risk. Moving to follow resources meant constantly entering unfamiliar territory, and without fire to light camps or fend off nocturnal hunters. Every relocation was a gamble. Rival human groups might view you as competition, and without large numbers, you couldn't intimidate them with strength alone. The result? A world where human density stayed low, survival rates stayed fragile, and the margin for error was razor thin. You weren't thriving. You were existing, one cold night, one predator encounter, or one bad foraging day away from catastrophe. And with so few of you around, losing even a small percentage of your group to something preventable, like a mild illness or a bad meal, was devastating. Which leads us straight into the next joy of life without fire. How even minor injuries or sickness could take you out completely. Because in your fireless life, it didn't take a saber-toothed cat to kill you. A splinter could do the job just fine. See, without fire, you didn't just lose the warmth and light. You lost one of the oldest sterilization methods humans ever had. A cut, a scrape, a puncture wound, anything that broke the skin was now a potential death sentence. Because you had no reliable way to kill the bacteria crawling on your tools, your hands, or the wound itself. That innocent thorn prick you got while foraging. Give it a week and it could swell, redden, and fill with pus. All while you developed a fever and started realizing you weren't going to see the next migration. There was no boiling water to clean wounds, no heat to sterilize sharp stones or bone needles, no warm compress to draw out infection. If something got inside you, dirt, splinters, animal saliva, your immune system had to deal with it, solo. And if it failed, you were on the express route to sepsis. And sepsis doesn't care how fit, young, or experienced you are. Foodborne illness was another silent killer. We've already covered how raw food could bring you parasites, bacteria, and viruses. But here's the thing. Without fire, you couldn't even try to cook it off. If your stomach turned against you, dehydration could kill you in a matter of days, especially without the ability to boil contaminated water. And remember, your only rehydration solution was probably the same dirty water that made you sick in the first place. Cold injuries added to the list. Frostbite wasn't just about losing a finger, it was about what happened next. Dead tissue becomes a breeding ground for infection, and without surgical removal or sterilization, that infection could spread to the bloodstream. Even minor hypothermia, shivering that didn't go away after sunrise, could weaken your immune system enough to let a common illness finish you off. And let's not forget dental disasters. Without cooked food, your diet was full of tough, fibrous plants and hard seeds. Wear and tear on your teeth was constant, and if a tooth cracked or decayed, there was no dentist, no antiseptic rinse, no warm saltwater gargle. A rotten tooth could turn into an abscess, which could turn into a fatal infection. Imagine dying because a seed got stuck in your molar. Welcome to the pre-fire era. Injuries from hunting or foraging carried their own risks. A twisted ankle could immobilize you, making it impossible to gather food or keep up with the group. Burns weren't an issue. You had no fire, but you could still get crushed by a falling branch, gored by an animal, or just cut yourself on sharp stone. And since there were no splints, no clean dressings, and no way to rest without freezing or starving, your recovery often ended in your group, leaving you behind. Childbirth was another major hazard. Without warmth, sterilization, or proper aftercare, infections and complications were common. Mothers and infants died frequently from things that modern medicine can handle in an afternoon. And when your population is already small, losing people to preventable problems like this wasn't just tragic, it was a threat to your group's survival. So every day you walked around in a body that could be ended by the smallest injury or infection, knowing that survival wasn't just about dodging predators or finding food. It was about somehow staying intact in a world full of sharp edges, dirty water, and no backup plan. And even if you managed that, there was still one more thing stacked against you. The limits of your social and cultural life when you couldn't gather after dark to share, teach, or plan. Because without fire, your evenings weren't for stories, ideas, or bonding. They were for sitting in the dark, conserving heat, and quietly wondering which noise outside was going to kill you first. Later humans with fire turned the night into a second working shift for the mind. Around a hearth, people could weave baskets, make tools, tell stories, teach skills, plan hunts, and reinforce group identity. Without that light, your nightly meeting consisted of lying in silence, trying not to breathe too loudly. If you needed to say something important, you whispered it into the black void and hoped the person you were talking to was the right one. No flicker of firelight to read expressions, no group laughter to strengthen bonds, just words disappearing into the dark like they'd never been spoken. That lack of extended social time had a cost. Culture moves slowly when you can only share knowledge during daylight hours, and daylight was already swallowed by survival tasks. Teaching tool making. It happened in stolen minutes between foraging and butchering. Passing on navigation skills. You had to do it while actively traveling, with no evening map sessions by the fire to rehearse routes. Even storytelling, the glue of oral tradition, was cramped into quick, functional bursts. You couldn't settle in for a saga. You got the cliff notes before everyone fell asleep from cold and hunger. And cognitive development. Fire fundamentally changed human brains. But before it, your mental energy was limited by the raw diet, constant cold stress, and lack of secure rest. Every waking hour was survival-focused, leaving little bandwidth for abstract thought. That doesn't mean you weren't capable. It means the environment didn't give you the luxury to sit around pondering what if, when what now was already too much. The absence of nighttime light also meant you didn't get the same practice in reading subtle social cues. Firelight exaggerates expressions and gestures, helping humans fine-tune empathy and cooperation. Without it, your interactions were shorter, flatter, and more functional, closer to pass the hide than tell me your hopes and dreams. Cooperation still happened, of course, survival demanded it, but the layers of social complexity that emerged later were still just seeds. Group cohesion also took a hit. Without communal fires, your camp didn't have a single gathering point where everyone came together daily. People drifted off to sleep in smaller clusters, and over time, that fragmented social structure could weaken group solidarity. A big, unified we was harder to maintain when you spent every night in separate pockets of darkness. And then, there's security. With no central fire as a focal point, you had no organized night watch. Danger in the dark was everyone's problem, which meant it was also nobody's specific job. A predator or rival human could pick off the edge of the group without half of you even realizing it until morning. Fire later became the psychological anchor of safety. Without it, the night belonged to everything but you. So, in a very real sense, the absence of fire wasn't just about the physical discomforts, the cold, the raw food, the predators. It was about the ceiling it put on what your species could become. Your body was busy not dying. Your mind was busy not wandering. You weren't gathering to imagine new tools or new ways of living. You were just making it to sunrise. And that was the ultimate limitation of life before fire. You could survive, if you were lucky, but thriving, That was still a few 100,000 years, and a spark away. It would not have arrived quietly. The first fire a human saw would have roared into existence with no polite explanation, spilling light and heat into a world used to the slow fate of the sun. Lightning had probably done the work, a strike into dry grass, the spark running quick and hungry, until whole patches of landscape were flickering and breaking apart into ash. Volcanic vents could have done it too, a slower kind of birth, but no less intimidating, the ground itself bleeding orange light. The reaction would not have been casual curiosity. Early humans already knew heat from the sun, but here it was concentrated, alive, moving on its own. It hissed, cracked, spat, and consumed. The smell alone, resin, burning hair, charred leaves, would have been intoxicating and terrifying in equal measure. Predators fled from it. Prey was blinded or cornered by it. In the chaos of a natural fire, the line between danger and opportunity was thin. Archaeological sites like Wonderwork Cave in South Africa suggest that humans were experimenting with this strange force as early as 1 million years ago, though experimenting in this case likely meant standing at the edge of a smoldering patch, watching, waiting for the heat to drop enough to approach. Charred bones from these early sites hint at the first taste of roasted meat, not cooked by design, but taken from the ruins of a burn. It would have tasted unlike anything raw, softer, richer, easier to chew. A lesson learned not through innovation but through scavenging. The first contact was less about control and more about proximity. Staying too close was lethal, but staying far away meant losing whatever benefits it might offer. Those who dared to edge nearer would have learned its moods, how flames leaped when wind shifted, how smoke thickened before the fire moved, how embers hid heat long after the light had faded. The danger was not in knowing too little, but in misjudging its patience. In those early moments, fire wasn't a tool. It was a phenomenon, unpredictable, vast, and indifferent. It was the kind of thing that reshaped the way a group understood its place in the world. Here was something that could kill, but also something that frightened the same animals that hunted them. Something that destroyed, but left behind new possibilities. The first human to stand in the warmth of a dying fire would have felt the contradiction, a danger worth keeping, and keeping it would become the next obsession, because once a flame was carried away from the wild and brought into camp, it was no longer just a patch of heat in the grass. It became something else entirely, a presence that needed guarding. Once it had been taken from the wild, fire stopped behaving like a natural disaster and started acting like a demanding guest. It was never enough to have it. The work was in making sure it didn't die, without the ability to create a spark from nothing. Every flame was borrowed from somewhere else, and every ember was precious. If it went out, it might be days, weeks, or months before another lightning strike or wildfire offered a replacement. The early hearths archaeologists have uncovered, shallow pits lined with stone. Their walls, blackened with soot, weren't simply cooking spots. They were protective cradles. The wind could kill a flame in seconds, so fire was often nested deep inside shelters, shielded from drafts. Rain was even worse. One careless downpour and the entire group could be back to cold nights, raw food, and predators creeping in closer after sunset. Keeping a flame alive meant constant attention. At night, someone had to feed it, gently, with dry twigs or splinters shaved from larger logs. In damp conditions, fuel had to be stored inside the shelter or under rock ledges. Wet wood smoldered, smoked, and sulked instead of burning. If the group was moving camp, the fire moved to glowing embers tucked into hollowed-out pieces of wood, bundles of bark, or even carried inside large shells. Carriers had to walk carefully. A stumble could scatter weeks of survival in a puff of ash. It wasn't just a chore, it was a role. In many forager societies where firemaking was rare or unreliable, specific individuals became the firekeepers. They were trusted with the group's warmth, its safety at night, its ability to cook and share food. Some anthropologists believe this role carried real status, a form of authority born from necessity. Losing the flame under one's watch was more than an inconvenience. It could be a failure with life or death consequences. The difficulty of keeping it alive also shaped the rhythm of life. Camps formed around a central flame, people sleeping close enough to feel its heat, but far enough to avoid sparks. Hunting trips, foraging expeditions, Even disputes were timed with the needs of the hearth. If the fire was weak, someone stayed behind to feed it. If it was strong, it became the gravitational center of the group's movements. A flame was not just warmth, it was continuity. The embers that burned in the center of a shelter could be the same ones carried from a distant valley months before, split from another group's hearth, or gifted in an alliance. It had a lineage, even if it couldn't be seen, and that lineage needed defenders, because a living flame could be stolen as easily as it could be lost, which is why the figure of the firekeeper began to shift from a practical caretaker into something closer to a custodian of the sacred. In time, the person tending the flame stopped being just the one stuck with the chore and became something closer to a ritual office. Fire wasn't yet a convenience, it was a force that shaped whether the group lived comfortably, survived barely, or didn't survive at all. Whoever kept it alive held a kind of quiet power, and in many early societies, that role took on ceremonial weight. Ethnographic studies of recent forager and horticultural peoples give hints at how this might have looked in the deep past. Among some Australian Aboriginal groups, the firetender's role was often given to older women, their experience and steadiness prized over brute strength. In parts of the Arctic and subarctic, women tended the hearths inside skin tents or semi-subterranean homes, feeding them with precious driftwood or stored moss. In the Americas, there were communities where young men were selected as flame guards during migrations, carrying embers in carefully prepared bark containers. The task was never casual. A firekeeper didn't wander far, didn't take unnecessary risks. During storms, they were the ones crouched over the coals, using their own bodies as wind. If the group traveled, they often walked at the center of the column, the embers cupped inside protective bundles to shield them from rain and wind. In some traditions, these glowing bundles were never set down directly on the ground, as if the earth itself might steal the fire away if it wasn't respected. The association between flame and sacred duty grew naturally. Fire could not be created easily, but it could be extinguished with a single mistake. It transformed food, kept predators away, extended the hours of activity. It was warmth in cold seasons, light in darkness, a tool for reshaping materials. In groups, without other forms of stored energy, fire was the only steady resource, and steady resources tend to invite ritual. Over generations, tending it began to involve taboos. Among the Iroquois, for example, the central council fire was never allowed to go out, a symbolic link to unity. In Shinto tradition, certain shrine fires were preserved for centuries, reignited only in carefully prescribed ceremonies. These are echoes of a time when losing the flame was not symbolic misfortune, but a real, physical setback that could mean hunger or exposure. In the earliest contexts, sacred wasn't an abstract quality. It was the recognition that some things had to be treated as beyond ordinary, because ordinary treatment would ruin them. A firekeeper's status might not have been loud or showy, but it was backed by the constant awareness that without them, the group's comfort, safety, and even survival could vanish in a wisp of smoke. That sense of centrality reshaped the camp itself. The flame didn't just sit anywhere, it was given a place, a focus, a heart around which the rest of life revolved. Once a flame was more than just a practical tool, it demanded a proper seat at the center of things. The hearth wasn't a random patch of scorched ground, it became the fixed heart of a dwelling, or the gravitational point of an open-air camp. Archaeological traces from sites like Gesher, Banot, Yakov in Israel, or the Paleolithic hearths of Europe show repeated burning in the same exact spot over decades, even centuries. People built their lives around these circles of ash. Placement mattered. In caves, the hearth was often set just far enough from the entrance to be shielded from wind and rain, but close enough that smoke could escape. In open camps, stones ringed the fire to hold the coals, shield them from gusts, and create a small stage for cooking. These stone circles were rarely dismantled. They marked a place where the group gathered, worked, and ate. Returning to a seasonal camp might mean reigniting the fire in the same prepared pit year after year, an act that blurred the line between habit and ritual. The hearth's location dictated the shape of the living space. Sleeping areas radiated outward from it, with the most valued or senior members often closest to the warmth. Toolmaking, food preparation, and storytelling all happened in its orbit. The fire wasn't just part of the home, it was the organizing principle, the anchor that turned scattered individuals into a group sharing one patch of ground. It's easy to imagine the quiet ceremonial language that might have grown up around it. Who was allowed to approach? Who could stir the coals? Who could add fuel? Even without written rules, these practices created a rhythm of respect. A hearth could be the site of daily cooking and also the stage for occasional rites, lighting it for the first time after migration, or letting it burn down at the end of a season. The last embers watched until they winked out. The light from the hearth also created a physical boundary. Its glow defined the safe zone inside the circle of light. Work, talk, and repair could happen. Beyond it, the dark pressed in with all its hazards. That visual boundary likely reinforced its symbolic one. This was the group's center, the place where their warmth and security were kept alive. And as the hearth became a fixed and central place, it began to collect stories, not just of meals cooked or tools made, but of where fire had come from in the first place. Which is why, alongside the practical care for flame, there grew a parallel tradition, the myths and cosmologies explaining how humans got it at all. No matter where humans lived, the question eventually surfaced: why do we have this thing when the rest of the animal world doesn't? Fire was too strange, too powerful, too unlike anything else in daily life to escape explanation. Myths grew to fill the gap between the practical act of tending a flame and the mystery of how it entered human hands in the first place. In Greek tradition, it was Prometheus, the titan who stole fire from the gods and paid for it with eternal torment. Among the Embori, the fire goddess Mahuika kept it hidden in her fingernails, releasing it to the hero Mui only through trickery and persistence. The San people of southern Africa tell of the mantis deity, Kagan, stealing fire from an ostrich, while in Andean myths, fire often comes as a gift from a lightning god or is discovered after a cosmic flood. Different landscapes, different animals, but the same core idea. Fire was not invented, it was taken often at great risk, from a realm beyond the ordinary. These stories share a consistent undertone. Fire is alive. It can be given, it can be stolen, it can be offended. It eats, it breathes, it dies if neglected. Many animistic traditions personify it as a spirit, with moods, quick to anger, slow to forgive, generous when cared for. The hearth wasn't just a physical center of camp. It was a guest with a personality, deserving of respect and certain courtesies. Archaeology can't unearth myths, but it can hint at the reverence, careful arrangements of ash and charcoal in ancient hearths, avoidance of trampling certain areas, and evidence of repeated use over generations all suggest that these fires were not treated as casual conveniences. Even the practice of carrying embers from one site to another had a ceremonial feel, a physical link to the fire's origin, sometimes over landscapes and lifetimes. The cosmologies also served a practical role. When fire is explained as a divine gift or a sacred theft, rules for its care take on moral weight. Neglecting it isn't just wasteful, it's a violation, sometimes punishable not just by social scolding, but by supernatural consequences. If you were the one whose carelessness let the flame die, you hadn't just lost a tool, you had broken a pact with something higher. And yet, alongside the sacred came the undeniable practical magic of what fire could do. Reverence didn't stop people from noticing its usefulness, and usefulness didn't stop them from weaving stories to frame it. The myths told around the flames were just as much about what fire gave to humans as how it arrived, which brings the story back to its transformations, both of the body and the landscape. Once the myths had given fire its personality, the daily work of living with it revealed just how radically it could reshape human existence. Cooking was the most obvious transformation, and it didn't just make food tastier, it made it more nutritious. Richard Wrangham's cooking hypothesis argues that heating food breaks down plant cell walls and denatures proteins in meat, allowing the body to absorb more calories with less chewing and digestion time. In evolutionary terms, that's not just convenience, that's survival, with side effects that may have shaped our very anatomy. Predator avoidance was another quiet revolution. Before fire, the dark hours belonged to whatever could see in them better than you, which was most of the animal kingdom. A burning log was more than light, it was a moving deterrent. Large cats, hyenas and wolves were less likely to approach a camp where flames flickered and smoke carried the scent of burning wood. The glow made night less of a blind guessing game and more of a controlled environment. Fire also rewrote the daily schedule. Without it, work ended when the sun went down. With it, People could repair tools, prepare hides, or tell stories deep into the night. Anthropologists studying contemporary hunter-gatherer groups have found that nighttime around the fire tends to be when the most complex, abstract conversations happen. Myths, moral lessons, shared histories, the kinds of talk that strengthen group cohesion and transmit cultural knowledge. Then there was material transformation. Fire-hardened spear points shaped wooden tools and helped in processing plant fibers. In colder regions, it allowed the drying and smoking of meat, turning perishable kills into long-lasting stores. It even played a role in land management. Early forms of controlled burning cleared brush, encouraged new plant growth, and altered hunting grounds. But each of these uses came with the same silent requirement. The flame had to be there in the first place. It's one thing to recognize that a cooked tuber is easier to eat than a raw one. It's another to make sure the coals are still alive after a night of wind and damp. The practical magic only worked if the practical guardianship held. And yet, despite all this ingenuity, fire remained fragile. It could be lost in an afternoon and take weeks to replace. Which is why many societies didn't just value the flame itself, but celebrated the rare and difficult moments when it had to be made anew, the ceremonies of rekindling. For all the skill in carrying embers, there came moments when a flame died completely through neglect, accident, or disaster, and no nearby group could offer a replacement. In those moments, the rekindling of fire became an event worth remembering, even celebrating. It wasn't simply the start of a new flame. It was the restoration of a lifeline. Before the mastery of spark-making tools, rekindling meant labor and coordination. Friction methods, such as the hand drill or bow drill, demanded dry materials, steady rhythm, and physical endurance. Striking certain stones together to produce sparks, like flint against iron pyrite, required a trained eye and patience. In many cultures, these skills were concentrated in the hands of specialists, and watching them work was a kind of performance. Anthropologists note that in societies without constant access to fire, the act of creating it was often tied to ritual purity. In parts of Polynesia, for example, new fire might be kindled only by individuals observing strict taboos, abstaining from certain foods, isolating from the group, or performing chants during the process. Among some North American tribes, the new fire ceremony marked the beginning of a seasonal cycle. With all old fires extinguished before the new one was lit in a central hearth and distributed to every household, rekindling could also act as a symbolic reset. In agricultural communities, it sometimes aligned with planting seasons. In nomadic ones, it might mark the end of a long migration. The extinguishing of every hearth before lighting a single, communal flame reinforced social unity. The act said, in effect, "This is our shared beginning, and from this point forward, every spark comes from the same source." Even the physical process lent itself to ceremony. The first curl of smoke, the faint glow of a forming ember, the moment when it took to dry tinder and flared into open flame. These were moments to pause, to watch, to acknowledge. In places where myths described fire as a gift from deities or ancestors, the rekindling was a reenactment of that original bestowal. Once lit, the new flame often traveled outward, carried in torches or covered vessels, reanimating every hearth in the settlement. That distribution, too, carried meaning. The central fire was not just symbolic, it was literally the parent of every other flame. And in an age before gaslighters and matches, that lineage could stretch back years, even decades, unbroken until some accident forced the cycle to start anew. Of course, no amount of ceremony could hide the underlying anxiety. A flame could be lost again tomorrow, which meant that, once rekindled, it returned to the same guarded status it had always held, a living thing that demanded protection. And protecting it didn't just mean keeping it alive. It also meant keeping it out of the wrong hands. If fire was life, then stealing it was a form of conquest. Long before the concept of territory or written treaties, groups measured power partly by whether they had fire and whether they could take it from others. The theft of a flame wasn't simply mischief. It could cripple a rival's ability to cook food, stay warm, or defend themselves at night. In some parts of Australia, anthropologists recorded accounts of intergroup raids aimed not at land or livestock, but at embers. A swift strike into an enemy camp, grabbing a burning brand or scooping coals into a bark container, could turn the tide of a survival struggle. In the Arctic and subarctic, where driftwood and dry tinder were rare, stealing fire might be the most efficient and ruthless form of resource acquisition. The tactics were often quick and low profile. Fire didn't have to be dragged home in a dramatic torch. A single smoldering fragment, protected from wind and moisture, was enough to rebuild a hearth. The knowledge of how to carry it, tucked into moss, wrapped in animal hide, nested in bark, made it possible to move fire over long distances without reigniting it along the way. Theft wasn't always hostile. In some traditions, visiting parties would borrow fire as a diplomatic exchange, sometimes offering goods or food in return. Yet the potential for tension was always there. Losing a fire to theft wasn't just a loss of heat and light. It was a public admission that the group had failed to defend one of its most essential resources. The mythology around stolen fire reflects this tension. Across cultures, trickster figures from the Mbori hero Mui to the sand mantis deity Kagan are often celebrated for stealing fire from a more powerful being. In human-to-human conflicts, though, the act could mark the start of a feud, escalating into open violence. The vulnerability of fire in conflict may also explain why many societies made it a collective responsibility to guard the hearth. Camps and settlements were arranged so that the flame was not just central but visible, with those sleeping nearest acting as its first line of defense. In the event of attack, someone would grab the fire before weapons. And yet, as much as theft shaped the politics of early fire use, the flame itself had another way of escaping human control. It could run wild. If a stolen brand could empower a group, an uncontrolled blaze could destroy them all. Which brings the story to the other side of fire's personality, the disasters it caused. For all its warmth and utility, fire was never a tame companion. The same energy that roasted meat and scared away predators could, under the wrong circumstances, erase a settlement in an afternoon. Long before cities and crowded streets, wildfires were a fact of life, and sometimes a direct consequence of human carelessness. Archaeological evidence from regions like the African savanna and the Australian bush suggests that early humans practiced small-scale burning to clear brush or drive game. But the line between controlled and catastrophic was as thin then as it is now. A sudden change in wind, a patch of dry grass, and what was meant to be a ring of safety could become an expanding wall of flame. The risks were magnified in certain environments. In grasslands, fire could move so quickly that there was no outrunning it. In dense forests, smoke could suffocate long before flames arrived. Even in open tundra regions, wind could carry sparks across surprising distances, igniting stored fuel or shelters. For groups that traveled light, losing a single fire wasn't fatal, but losing shelters, tools, and food stores to a runaway blaze could tip the balance toward famine. Some traditions developed strict rules about when and how fire could be used outdoors. Among Australian Aboriginal groups, firestick farming was timed to particular seasons, when the land was moist enough to prevent uncontrolled spread. In parts of North America, controlled burns were often coordinated across communities, reducing fuel buildup while minimizing the risk to dwellings. But these measures didn't eliminate the danger. In myth, fire that escaped human control often became an expression of divine anger, a punishment for disrespect, a reminder that fire belonged to the gods before it belonged to people. The image of flames leaping beyond the hearth reinforced the idea that fire was alive, with its own will, and that will could turn destructive. Survivors of accidental blazes sometimes faced a strange irony. They were left in the same position as those who had never mastered fire at all. No embers, no cooking, no warmth, just the knowledge of what they'd lost. And rebuilding after a fire wasn't just about rekindling the flame. It was about re-establishing trust in something that had just proven how dangerous it could be. That paradox, dependence on something inherently unstable, kept fire in a unique category. It was not like stone tools or woven baskets. It could not be stockpiled, could not be left unattended, could not be fully controlled. And that tension between necessity and risk is what kept fire bound up in ritual, guarded as if it were not just a resource, but a living god. By the time humans had learned to keep flame for generations, it had outgrown its role as a simple survival tool. Fire had become shorthand for life itself, the visible, tangible proof that a group was not just alive, but capable, organized, and connected to something greater. Two outsiders, a column of smoke on the horizon, didn't just mark a camp. It marked a people who had secured the one element that defined human difference. In many traditions, the hearth's flame was treated as an unbroken line linking the living to their ancestors. Among the Zoroastrians, sacred fires were kept burning for centuries, tended by generations of priests. In Japan's Shinto tradition, the Omiwa shrine preserves a flame said to have been kept alive for over 1,000 years. While these examples are far more recent than Paleolithic hearths, they echo the same instinct. A flame is not just something you light, it's something you inherit. That symbolism extended into power structures. Control over fire, whether the ability to make it, to protect it, or to grant it to others, often mirrored control over people. Leaders might claim the right to the first lighting of seasonal fires, or reserve certain flames for ceremonial use. In some places, a village's central fire was under the care of a chief or spiritual figure, and taking a brand from it without permission was both theft and sacrilege. The metaphors practically wrote themselves. Fire was vitality. Fire was spirit. A person without fire was cold or dead, even if they were breathing. To give fire could mean granting life, safety, or favor. And in the other direction, to extinguish someone's fire was to end their claim to a place in the living world. This symbolism seeped into migration patterns, marriage rituals, and seasonal festivals. New households might receive embers from their parents' hearth as a literal continuation of the family line. Festivals could revolve around extinguishing all flames, then relighting them from a single source to renew the bond between scattered homes. Even in warfare, burning an enemy's hearth could be as much about erasing their identity as about destroying their resources. By the time metallurgy, cities, and written language emerged, fire's sacred status was already deeply embedded. And while its divine mystique has faded in an age of lighters and electric stoves, the traces are still there, in the candles we light for remembrance, the eternal flames over tombs, the torches carried in ceremonies. The god may no longer demand constant feeding, but the memory of when it did still flickers in the human mind. Long before anyone struck flint or learned to coax sparks from dry sticks, fire arrived in stories carried on the breath of gods, tricksters, and stubborn heroes. In the Greek imagination, it was Prometheus who dared to steal it from the heavens, smuggling it to humankind hidden in the hollow of a fennel stalk, a detail that sounds poetic until you realize fennel stalks are both hollow and surprisingly flammable, making it a very practical choice for smuggling contraband flame. The punishment was grotesque enough to become a cultural tattoo, chained to a rock, liver torn out daily by an eagle. The message was clear. Fire was not meant to be yours, and taking it would cost you something dear, preferably repeatedly. Half a world away, in the Vedic hymns of ancient India, the god Agni wasn't stolen so much as courted. Born in the sky, dwelling in lightning, he was invited into human settlements through careful ritual. Every flame lit was him arriving anew, and with it came both blessings and the expectation of proper hospitality. Neglecting the sacred fire was like letting a divine guest sleep outside. It wasn't just impolite, it was cosmic negligence. In Polynesian tradition, the hero Mui pried fire from the clenched fists of the goddess Mahuika, whose fingers were literally made of flame. The process, unsurprisingly, involved losing several of those flaming fingers in the transaction, each becoming a different tree whose wood could be used for firemaking. The fact that her body parts turned into kindling is the sort of mythic logic that, once heard, makes you understand why taboos around fire felt so inevitable. After all, you're not just burning wood, you might be burning a goddess's thumb. These myths weren't quaint bedtime stories, they were instructional codes. They made fire something you inherited, not something you discovered by accident. It didn't matter if lightning had set a tree alight, or if a volcano's molten throat spilled embers across the earth. What mattered was that the flame was framed as a gift, and gifts come with obligations. You couldn't treat it like a pile of sticks. You had to tend it, feed it, and sometimes even worship it. In societies where oral tradition held more authority than written law, such myths did more than explain origins. They set boundaries. If a god had sacrificed something to give fire, then squandering it wasn't just wasteful, it was an insult. The smallest ember could be linked, in imagination and ritual, all the way back to its divine source. That sense of lineage made a hearth more than a campfire. It was a living connection to the supernatural, a small, controlled piece of the sky. And because of that, the handling of fire became less about skill and more about legitimacy. You didn't simply light a fire, you received it, as if it were a crown or a ceremonial blade. Which is why, in so many places, not everyone was allowed to touch it at all. If fire came from the gods, it wasn't for just anyone's grubby hands. Across the world, early societies wrapped its handling in rules so dense you'd think the flame might bruise if the wrong person looked at it too hard. In some Pacific Island communities, the hearth belonged to the domain of elder women, the mothers of the settlement, whose authority over it was absolute. Young men, full of the kind of confidence that gets people killed, were often kept away entirely, lest their clumsy hands let the flame die, and with it, the village's spiritual insurance policy. Elsewhere, the opposite rule applied. In certain African and Arctic groups, fire tending was the duty of designated men. Sometimes warriors returned from the hunt, as if bravery in front of a charging animal translated to competence with embers. In these cases, fire was a masculine burden. Not because women couldn't tend it, they could, and often did in private spaces, but because the public hearth was a symbol of the group's collective life, and whoever guarded it was effectively guarding everyone's tomorrow. Among some indigenous Australian peoples, the fire-making sticks themselves could be taboo objects, passed only from one initiated person to another. Handling them without permission wasn't just a breach of etiquette, it could mark you as spiritually dangerous, the human equivalent of a cursed object. Even if no one caught you, the belief was that the fire itself knew, and could turn against you going out, burning too fiercely, or producing smoke that carried your shame into the sky. The logic behind these restrictions wasn't mystical nonsense to the people living them. It was practical. When your survival depended on one small source of heat, light, and protection, letting an untrained hand poke at it was like giving a toddler the keys to the only food store. But practical reasons alone don't make for lasting rules. What keeps a regulation alive for centuries is when you add the weight of cosmic consequence. So the act of tending fire became a performance. The one allowed to feed the flame did it, with deliberate movements, often in silence, as though speaking too loudly might scare it away. Outsiders would watch with a mix of reverence and mild fear, reminded that this wasn't just about cooking dinner, it was about keeping the thin line between life and death from snapping. And because power loves to root itself in ritual, those who could handle the fire often handled other things, ceremonies, dispute settlements, even marriage arrangements. The flame was a credential in itself. But credentials, of course, could also be revoked, and in some places, losing the right to tend the fire was a punishment worse than exile. For much of human history, you didn't just strike a spark and call it a day. Lighting a new fire was less a task and more a ceremony, and if you thought you could do it after wiping your hands on whatever you'd been skinning for dinner, you'd be stopped faster than a sneeze in a monastery. In Zoroastrian fire temples, for instance, a sacred flame wasn't just lit once and left alone. It was born through an elaborate purification process. Wood was selected not for how well it burned, but for how ritually clean it was, trees untouched by disease, bark unblemished, cut in ways that didn't offend the spirits inhabiting them. The embers were carried in special vessels that kept away dust, breath, or any wandering insect unlucky enough to fall in. Once established, that fire could burn for centuries, tended by priests whose every movement around it was a study in controlled reverence. The Celts had their own annual reset button, Beltane. On this day, every household hearth was deliberately extinguished, plunging entire communities into temporary darkness. Only then could a great communal fire be kindled, usually by friction, because sparks from iron could be seen as impure. From that single blaze, every hearth in the village was relit, tying everyone to the same flame. To keep your fire going from before Beltane was considered bad luck at best, an act of defiance at worst. Even outside of formal religion, purity rules crept in. In some native North American traditions, if a home's fire went out, you couldn't simply reignite it yourself. You had to request a coal or torch from a neighbor, often with a small offering. The idea was that fire wasn't just a tool, it carried social and spiritual lineage. Making one from scratch without the proper context was like forging a false family tree. And then there were prohibitions about where you could source your flame. Fires used for war or for cremation were considered polluted in many cultures. To bring such a flame into the home was to invite the dead, the enemy, or both, to sit down at your table. New fires had to be born clean, untainted by grief, conflict, or impurity. The deeper logic here wasn't superstition for its own sake. Fire spreads fast, both in nature and in meaning. If it began in a place of chaos, the thinking went, it could carry that chaos into your pot, your bed, and your bones. So you waited, you prepared, you purified, and only then did you dare to coax a new flame into life. Which meant, of course, that once a flame was born clean, you guarded it like treasure, because letting it die would mean starting the whole ordeal over again. A fire wasn't just a heat source, it was a fence you could see from space, or at least from the next ridge over. The hearth marked who was us and who was them, and in many societies, sharing it was the social equivalent of signing a treaty. Sit by someone's fire, and you were under their protection. Refuse to share yours, and you'd made it clear that no such protection existed. Among some indigenous Australian groups, taking fire without permission was not only rude, but an outright breach of law. It wasn't simply theft of a resource, it was theft of belonging. Fire was a communal identity, and stealing it was stealing a piece of the group's life. Even the method of handing over fire could carry meaning. Passing a burning stick directly into someone's hand might be seen as dangerous. The contact were intimate, so the stick would be laid down between you, the flame offered without the skin-to-skin exchange. In the Arctic, among Inuit and other northern peoples, hospitality often meant giving a guest a glowing coal to carry away wrapped in moss. It was generosity in its purest form, but it was also a declaration. You're leaving as a friend, not an enemy. Refusing such an offer could be taken as an insult, a way of saying you didn't want any part of their warmth, their food, or their fate. And then there were moments when fire was used deliberately to enforce division. In some African traditions, enemies were forbidden from taking flame from each other's hearths, even in famine. It was less about cruelty than about maintaining the boundary between groups, because once you let your fire mingle with theirs, the invisible lines of kinship began to blur. The symbolism didn't stop at the village level. In certain medieval European towns, public bonfires were lit to mark festivals or to unite neighborhoods. To not attend, or worse, to light your own competing fire, was a silent act of rebellion. Fire was political capital, and where you stood in relation to it could signal alliances as clearly as flying a banner. Even in domestic life, fire could mark boundaries within a single home. Separate hearths for men and women, or for guests and family, weren't just about cooking logistics, they were a way of structuring relationships, of deciding who belonged where. All of which meant that a fire's glow wasn't just illumination. It was a statement, a map, and sometimes a weapon. And when a flame could say so much without speaking, putting it out could be even louder. Some fires were never meant to die. In ancient Rome, the Vestal Virgins tended a flame in the Temple of Vesta that had burned for centuries without pause. Letting it go out wasn't just an accident, it was a state-level disaster, a bad omen for the empire itself. The unlucky priestess responsible could be beaten, though the greater punishment was the public disgrace, being remembered as the one who killed Rome's heart. Sacred flames had a way of turning practical necessity into moral obligation. Zoroastrian temples guarded their Atoshbaram fires with layers of ritual, ensuring no impurity ever touched them. If a flame was accidentally extinguished, it wasn't simply relit. It had to be reborn through a long sequence of purification rites, almost like a funeral followed by a christening. The logic was simple. If fire came from a divine source, letting it die was breaking the chain of divine favor. In smaller communities, the rule could be even more personal. Among some Native American tribes, the hearth fire in a home was kept alive for years, sometimes decades, with embers smothered under ash each night to preserve them until morning. Extinguishing it, unless someone in the household had died, was a breach of trust in the ancestors who had kept it alive before you. Extinguishing a fire could also be an act of symbolic violence. In certain Pacific traditions, putting out another group's flame was the same as declaring war. It stripped them of cooking, warmth, and spiritual protection in a single motion. No battle needed. The silence of their cold hearth was enough. Even in medieval Europe, certain festival bonfires were taboo to extinguish before their natural end. Jumping through the embers for luck was encouraged, but dousing the flame with water was seen as a bad omen. cutting short the blessings it was meant to release into the community. The endurance of these rules wasn't just about superstition. Maintaining an eternal flame meant never having to start from scratch, no fumbling with damp kindling, no pleading with flint that refused to spark. It was a practical insurance policy dressed in sacred language, but the sacred language stuck, and over time, people believed that some fires quite literally held the world together, and if some flames were too important to ever put out, others were considered too dangerous to ever use again. Death had a way of making fire either the most welcome guest or the most dangerous intruder. In Hindu cremation rites, for example, fire was the bridge between the living and the afterlife, a purifier that released the soul from the body. The flame used wasn't random. Often it was taken from the home hearth or a sacred source, linking the deceased's final journey to the fire that had sustained their life. But once that pyre was lit, no one would dream of using its embers for anything else. A cooking pot warmed over such a fire might as well have been a pot of curses. In other traditions, the death of a person meant the deliberate extinguishing of their household fire. Among certain indigenous North American peoples, the hearth was doused to sever the link between the living and the spirit of the dead. Lighting a new flame too soon was seen as an invitation for the ghost to wander back in, following the heat like a moth. The mourning period dictated when it was safe to bring fire into the home again. Sometimes days, sometimes moons later. The taboo could extend even further. In parts of Polynesia, fire itself was avoided during mourning, with food eaten cold and nights spent in darkness. The absence of flame was both a sign of grief and a way of marking time, a lived reminder that light and warmth were privileges, not constants. Among the ancient Greeks, the hearth fire was intimately tied to the goddess Hestia, protector of the household. When someone died, their flame was ritually extinguished and then relit from the communal hearth, a symbolic reset that reconnected the family to the living community, not the underworld. Even where cremation wasn't practiced, fire still hovered at the edge of death. In some African traditions, torches were burned outside the home to ward off malevolent spirits while mourning took place. These protective flames were discarded afterwards, never brought back inside. It's tempting to see all this as superstition, but the pattern is pragmatic. Death disrupts the normal order, and fire, with its power to sustain or destroy, is too potent to leave unregulated in those moments. You controlled it, contained it, or snuffed it entirely, because a flame in the wrong symbolic context could undo the fragile work of grief. And if death could make a fire dangerous, so too could the wrong kind of life. The chaos of war had its own set of rules for flame. In the politics of early societies, fire was more than a household tool. It was a diplomatic instrument. In some African kingdoms, peace negotiations weren't sealed with signatures but with shared embers. A leader might take a burning brand from his hearth and hand it to the emissary of another group, a silent declaration that our survival is now tied to yours. Refusing such a gift was as good as announcing that talks had failed. Other times, fire marked the end of hostilities in more theatrical ways. Among certain indigenous peoples of North America, extinguishing a war fire and lighting a new peace fire was the final step of reconciliation. This wasn't symbolic fluff, it was a way of resetting the political atmosphere. A flame born in war was thought to carry its aggression forward. To make peace, you had to kill it and start clean. On the flip side, the absence of fire could be a weapon. In siege warfare across Eurasia, raiding parties sometimes destroyed an enemy's hearths before winter, ensuring starvation and chaos without a single blade raised. A cold, dark settlement was both a tactical and psychological victory. No light to signal resilience, no smoke to show the hearth was alive. Fire also featured in truces in Polynesia. A temporary cessation of hostilities could be marked by allowing enemies to collect fire from each other's camps, a fragile privilege that could be revoked the moment tensions rose again. Similarly, in medieval Europe, shared bonfires during certain feast days allowed even rival factions to gather without fear, the neutral flame acting as a temporary truce line. But just as fire could make peace, it could also ensure the opposite. Lighting a hostile flame, a torch thrown into an enemy's fields, a brand carried into their home, was a clear declaration of war. In many cultures, the act preceded any formal battle, signaling that diplomacy had been abandoned. And because war and peace are never truly permanent, the same flame that lit a treaty one season could be burning down a neighbor's granary the next. In many traditional societies, the year wasn't just marked by moons or harvests. It was measured in when you could and couldn't light certain fires. Among the ancient Celts, Samhain marked not only the end of the harvest but the deliberate extinguishing of all hearth fires. The darkness wasn't neglect. It was a ritual pause before the community kindled a single, shared flame to carry them through the winter. Lighting a private fire during that gap was seen as hoarding luck, the kind of selfish act that could curse both you and your livestock. In Japan, some villages observed no fire days linked to Shinto purification cycles. On these days, cooking was done in advance, and even lamps remained unlit after dark. The absence wasn't meant to punish, it allowed the hearth to rest and rid itself of any spiritual pollution before the next cycle began. In Eastern Europe, certain Orthodox Christian feast days also carried prohibitions on lighting new fires, especially during Easter week. Flames during these periods had to be taken from the church's Paschal candle, which itself was lit from a sanctified source. Bringing in any other flame was considered spiritually invalid, even if it boiled your soup faster. Closer to the equator, seasonal taboos often coincided with agricultural calendars. In some West African traditions, no new fires could be lit during planting season without a blessing from the village elder. The restriction wasn't just symbolic. The ember you received from the elder's hearth was thought to carry fertility into the fields, ensuring crops would grow as the flame lives. The Arctic had its own seasonal logic. In some Inuit communities, the hearth fire was kept small and steady during certain hunting periods, partly for fuel conservation, but also to avoid angering animal spirits, who might be driven away by excess smoke or light. Killing a seal was hard enough. No one wanted to make it harder by flaunting a roaring fire at the wrong time of year. Across all these cases, the message was consistent. Fire didn't just belong to you. It was a tenant in your home, one whose schedule was negotiated with the cosmos, the calendar, and the community. Break that rhythm, and you weren't just ignoring tradition, you were knocking on the door of misfortune. And of course, once the calendar dictated the right time for a fire, it also dictated who was worthy of receiving it. In many cultures, you didn't simply have fire, you had to earn it. Among the Tiwi people of northern Australia, the right to handle fire was tied to age and initiation. Young boys could sit near the hearth, but only initiated men tended the larger ceremonial flames. Fire wasn't just heat, it was social power, and power had to be rationed. In some Amazonian groups, a young man's first independent fire-making was a rite of passage, complete with public scrutiny. If the tinder failed to catch, the laughter was merciless, because if you couldn't coax a spark into life, how could you possibly keep a family alive? In such cases, the ridicule wasn't just personal. It was a warning to the wider community that this one still needed watching. The Maasai, in parts of East Africa, took the idea further. Warriors in training learned to make fire without matches or lighters, using friction methods that demanded both patience and physical endurance. The first flame lit this way wasn't casually tossed into the cooking pot. It was used to start the communal hearth, linking the young man's skill to the tribe's collective survival. Ownership could also be a formal role. In certain Pacific Island communities, a designated firekeeper managed the village flame. This person wasn't simply a servant. They were a custodian of the group's continuity. Losing the fire under their watch could result in fines, loss of status, or ritual shaming, all reminders that this job carried the weight of the entire community's well-being. And once you'd been entrusted with fire, the rules tightened. You didn't just hand it over to anyone. In many North American tribes, passing fire to outsiders without permission was a punishable act, akin to leaking military secrets. A flame could carry more than heat. It could carry stories, blessings, or even curses, depending on its origin. Which is why, in some places, the act of handing fire over had its own choreography. The torch laid down between two people instead of directly handed, the receiving party bowing or offering payment. The exchange wrapped in a web of small gestures that made the transfer as much about respect as utility. Because once fire was in your hands, it was yours to guard, but also yours to answer for. And no matter how tightly you controlled it, fire still had a habit of slipping into the realm of the supernatural. In almost every corner of the world, flames have been treated less like a chemical reaction and more like a hotline to the other side. Among the Zoroastrians, fire wasn't just symbolic of purity, it was believed to embody Asha, cosmic truth itself. To stand before a temple flame was to stand in the presence of something uncorrupted, a witness that linked the human soul to divine order. The idea was so strong that even the smoke was kept free from pollution, rising clean into the sky, as if delivering messages in real time. In the Andes, Quechua communities once fed offerings of coca leaves and llama fat into ritual fires, sending their prayers upward to the apis, the mountain spirits. The flames weren't a metaphor, they were a delivery system, transforming solid gifts into a language the spirits could understand: heat, light, and smoke. In Siberia, shamans used fire in trance rituals as both a guide and a guard. The flicker of the flames was said to illuminate the path to the upper or lower worlds, while the circle of light kept hostile spirits at bay. Stepping outside that halo while in trance was courting disaster, not just spiritually, but physically, in the sub-zero dark. Among the Yoruba of West Africa, certain Orisha deities were invoked through fire rituals, where specific woods and resins were burned to call down their presence. The right scent and smoke patterns signaled that the god had arrived. The flame was both an invitation and a sign that the conversation had begun. Even in medieval Europe, the connection persisted. The Paschal candle in Christian liturgy symbolized the risen Christ, its flame blessed and guarded, carried into darkened churches to signify light conquering death. Parishioners would light their own candles from it, each tiny flame a portable fragment of that sacred bridge. Fire's role as a mediator between worlds also explains the care with which it was handled in funerary rites. In many cultures, the belief was clear: a properly tended flame could guide the dead where they needed to go, but a neglected or polluted one could leave them wandering. And so, long after fire became a tool of cooking, heating, and forging, it remained something more volatile, a living threshold, the closest humans could come to touching both worlds at once. And for all our modern switches and lighters, there's still a trace of that unease when we stare too long into a flame, as though it might be staring back.